The sea above was calm, indifferent to the crisis unfolding far below its surface. In the darkness of the Atlantic, a German U-boat lay immobilized on the ocean floor, its steel hull pressed into the mud like a gravestone. The depth gauges had stopped changing. The engines were silent. Inside, more than 40 men waited in air that was already turning stale. There would be no explosions, no gunfire, no visible enemy, only time and the slow arithmetic of oxygen. Submarine crews were trained to expect danger. They rehearsed flooding drills, practiced sealing compartments, memorized procedures for fire, collision, and depth charge attack. Yet no amount of training prepared them for stillness. When a boat could not surface and could not maneuver, skill became irrelevant. Experience offered no advantage against physics. Steel did not forgive mistakes, and the sea did not negotiate. The irony was absolute. The U-boat had been designed as a weapon of invisibility, silent, predatory, lethal. It had stalked convoys unseen, turning merchant ships into wreckage with calculated efficiency. Now that same stealth worked against its crew. There were no distress signals sent, no plume of smoke, no sign on the surface that men were trapped below, counting breaths. As minutes passed, carbon dioxide thickened the air. Headaches began first, followed by dizziness, then nausea. Sweat formed despite the cold. Machinery that normally hummed with life became obstacles, pipes to be leaned against, valves to be checked again and again, as if repetition might alter reality. Officers moved through the compartments, speaking calmly, measuring consumption rates, calculating how long consciousness could be preserved. Panic was not shouted, it was swallowed. Small failures became existential threats. A battery leak, a jammed ballast valve, a system designed for war, not rescue, now demanded perfection. Men who had survived depth-charge barrages now feared sleep, knowing they might not wake. Courage in this moment was not dramatic, it was procedural. And then came the realization that changed everything. Survival was no longer a matter of endurance alone. Time could not be stretched. Air could not be negotiated. Escape would require something else, an intervention so improbable it bordered on fantasy, and a rescue method few submariners had ever truly believed in. Far above the silent hull, in waters controlled by the enemy, a decision would soon be made. One that would determine whether this boat remained a weapon of war or became exactly what the ocean intended it to be. German submariners were taught to see themselves as an elite within the Kriegsmarine. Selection was rigorous, training relentless, discipline absolute. Life aboard a U-boat demanded trust without hesitation. Every man depended on the next. Every order followed without question. In combat, this cohesion turned steel and machinery into a single organism. Now, sealed beneath the Atlantic, those same virtues were all that remained. The boat lay motionless on the seabed, its keel settled into silt hundreds of feet below enemy-controlled waters. There would be no surfacing at dawn, no radio report to headquarters. The pressure outside the hull was constant and crushing, a reminder that escape was not a matter of distance, but of physics. Above them, Allied patrols moved freely, unaware of the silent vessel pinned beneath the waves. The submarine's technology, its ballast tanks, pressure hull, and watertight compartments, had been designed to defy the sea. In battle, these systems allowed the boat to vanish at will, to strike unseen and retreat into darkness. Now they worked in reverse. Valves that refused to clear, tanks that would not blow, mechanisms built for stealth rather than salvation. The weapon had become a lock. Inside, the air grew heavy. Condensation clung to the steel walls. Men spoke in measured voices, conserving energy, conserving oxygen. Claustrophobia pressed inward, not as panic, but as awareness of how little space separated life from death. Every unfamiliar sound suggested flooding. Every silence suggested something worse. Yet procedure endured. Damage control parties checked seals. Officers recalculated survival time. Even fear was regulated, folded into routine. Courage here was not charging a deck gun or launching a torpedo. It was remaining precise while the margin for error vanished. Gradually, a truth settled over the crew. Survival would not come from endurance alone. Discipline could slow panic, but it could not raise the boat. Their fate depended on a possibility few dared to voice: rescue in waters controlled by the enemy, using methods untested under such conditions. Somewhere beyond the hull, the war continued without pause. And above this trapped crew, a fragile window of time remained open, narrowing with every breath. The first signs were subtle. Breathing became shallow. Concentration slipped. The air inside the submarine no longer refreshed the lungs. It lingered, heavy with carbon dioxide. Chemical scrubbers were deployed, their capacity measured and finite. Every exhalation pushed the balance further against the men trapped inside. Time, once tracked by watches and routines, was now counted in percentages. Fatigue spread unevenly. Some men grew restless, others quiet. Training took over where instinct failed. Sailors rotated positions to limit exertion, spoke only when necessary, and followed procedures that had been rehearsed but never truly believed in. Ingenuity replaced optimism. Small adjustments, shutting systems, dimming lights, slowing movement, bought minutes, not solutions. Still, minutes mattered. The irony sharpened with every calculation. The submarine's strength had always been its enclosure, its ability to carry life deep into an environment hostile to humans. That same enclosure now denied escape. Steel that once promised protection became confinement. The line between dominance and helplessness revealed itself as alarmingly thin. As hours passed, desperation forced risk. Attempts were made to shift ballast manually, to improvise repairs under conditions never intended by designers. Sweat and condensation blurred vision. Men fought the urge to lie down, knowing that sleep would hasten suffocation. Psychological strain pressed harder than the water outside the hull. Near-certain death demanded discipline, not heroics. And yet beneath the exhaustion, something endured. The belief that skill and resolve might still matter. That the war had produced tools and minds capable of answering this crisis. The crew understood that if rescue came, it would not be routine. It would require daring, innovation, and a willingness to challenge assumptions long held by navies on both sides. Above them, unseen and uncertain, the possibility of salvation began to take shape. Fragile, experimental, and unproven. Whether it would arrive in time remained an unanswered question. By now, there was no illusion left inside the hull. The crew understood that no combination of procedure or improvisation would lift the boat from the seabed. The mathematics were unforgiving. Oxygen consumption could be slowed, carbon dioxide absorption delayed, but gravity and pressure could not be negotiated. If survival was possible, it would come only from above, from an external rescue few submariners ever expected to need. The decision to signal distress carried its own risks. Radio transmissions and emergency markers threatened to reveal the boat's position in waters patrolled by the enemy. For years, U-boat doctrine had been built around silence. Now silence guaranteed death. Messages were sent upward in controlled bursts, stripped of anything unnecessary, each transmission a calculated gamble between exposure and extinction. The irony was complete. These men had spent the war instilling fear in unseen opponents, striking without warning, disappearing before retaliation. Now they waited, powerless, hoping that someone, anyone, had heard them. The weapon had been reduced to a coordinate on a chart, its crew dependent on forces they could neither see nor influence. Above the surface, the response unfolded with agonizing uncertainty. Signals were incomplete, depth estimates imprecise. Locating a disabled submarine in the open Atlantic was a task measured not in hours, but in probabilities. Rescue vessels moved with urgency, yet every maneuver risked detection by Allied aircraft and ships that dominated the skies and sea lanes. Below, the crew marked time through sensation rather than clocks. Breathing grew labored, movements slowed, conversations shortened. The knowledge that help might be coming offered no immediate relief. Hope did not replenish air. What it did offer was purpose, a reason to endure, to maintain discipline, to remain alive long enough to be found. Rescue, if it came, would not be routine. It would demand precise navigation, unfamiliar equipment, and men willing to approach the edge of feasibility under wartime pressure. Mistakes would be final. Coordination would be everything. Somewhere on the surface, calculations were being made and courses plotted. Whether they would converge on the right patch of ocean before time ran out remained uncertain, but the race had begun. On the surface, the rescue effort began not with certainty, but with improvisation. Charts were spread across cramped operations rooms, and depth estimates were recalculated again and again. The technology required to reach a disabled submarine at such depth was still experimental, designed more in theory than practice. Yet delay was not an option. Every calculation carried the weight of lives measured in hours. Among naval officers and engineers, skepticism ran deep. Few believed that a trapped crew could remain alive long enough for help to arrive, let alone be extracted from a pressure hull resting far below the reach of conventional diving equipment. Wartime experience had taught them to expect losses, not recoveries. The sea, once claimed, rarely returned what it took. The irony was unavoidable. The same engineering genius that had produced submarines capable of paralyzing global trade now had to be redirected toward preservation rather than destruction. Dockyards that once refined torpedo systems now examined rescue hatches, pressure seals, and transfer chambers. Tools forged for dominance were repurposed for mercy. Time imposed its own discipline, weather windows narrowed. Mechanical tolerances left no margin for error. Rescue vessels carried equipment never tested under combat conditions, operated by crews aware that a single misalignment could doom those waiting below. Every winch, cable, and seal had to perform perfectly not once but repeatedly. Coordination became the true challenge. Engineers, sailors, and command staff worked across shifting conditions, communicating in fragments as ships maneuvered to avoid detection. Innovation was not a solitary act. It emerged from collaboration, from minds forced together by necessity rather than doctrine. Below the surface, the trapped crew could not see this effort taking shape. They waited in darkness, unaware of the arguments, the calculations, the fragile optimism forming above them. What connected both worlds was a single belief that human ingenuity, tested under its harshest conditions, might still succeed. As the rescue vessels moved into position, theory gave way to execution. And with that shift came the most dangerous moment of all, the point where hope had to survive contact with reality. Inside the disabled submarine, hope had become conditional. The crew understood that even if help was coming, it might arrive too late. Training had taught them to expect outcomes, not miracles. Still, they listened, straining for any vibration, any sound that did not belong to the dying rhythm of their own vessel. Waiting itself became an act of discipline. The first confirmation came not as a voice, but as contact. A faint metallic tremor traveled through the hull, unmistakable and foreign. Above them, rescue equipment had reached the boat. Lines were secured with deliberate care, guided by calculations made under pressure and corrected in real time. There was no margin for haste. Every movement had to be exact. What followed carried deep irony. This U-boat, once a predator of the Atlantic, now served as an anchor point for rescue operations. Men trained to avoid detection now relied on surface crews who risked exposure to save them. In war, roles rarely reversed so completely. Yet necessity stripped away ideology, leaving only the mechanics of survival. Extraction proceeded slowly. Each transfer required precise alignment, pressure equalization, and unwavering concentration. A single error could cost lives on both sides of the hatch. Crew members moved not as individuals, but as components in a sequence, waiting, advancing, sealing, releasing. Time compressed into procedure. Above and below the surface, courage took different forms. For those inside the submarine, it was restraint, the ability to wait while others were chosen first. For rescuers, it was proximity, operating at the limits of equipment in hostile waters. Skill was assumed. Precision was mandatory. As the operation continued, despair began to loosen its grip. What had seemed impossible only hours earlier now unfolded through discipline and cooperation. This was not triumph in the military sense. It was something quieter, the preservation of life achieved through collective resolve. But the most dangerous phase still lay ahead. With air nearly exhausted and time still against them, the rescue would be judged not by its beginning, but by whether it could finish before the sea reclaimed its silence. The evacuation did not begin with movement, but with restraint. Inside the submarine, men waited as procedures were explained again, their meaning sharpened by exhaustion. Panic was the greatest threat now. A rushed ascent, a broken seal, a single lapse in discipline could undo everything that had been achieved. Survival would depend on patience measured in breaths. Each transfer followed a strict sequence. A sailor entered the rescue chamber, the hatch sealed behind him, pressure slowly equalized. The process was deliberate, almost ceremonial, its pace dictated by physics rather than urgency. As water pressed against steel and gauges crept upward, training asserted itself. Men focused on steps, not outcomes. They trusted the method because there was no alternative. The irony was difficult to miss. This same vessel had once carried them silently into contested waters, delivering destruction with mechanical precision. Now it stood as a fragile bridge between life and death. Its compartments, once crowded with torpedoes and fuel, became waiting rooms for survival. War had reduced the submarine to its most basic function, keeping humans alive long enough to be saved. Time grew more oppressive with each extraction. Carbon dioxide levels inside the remaining compartments climbed, tightening the margin for those still below. Rescuers worked against a clock they could not see, guided only by calculations and the discipline of repetition. A cable snagged. A seal resisted. Minor problems demanded immediate solutions because there was no room for cumulative error. For the men waiting their turn, courage took a quieter form. They watched comrades depart, uncertain if they themselves would reach the chamber in time. Trust replaced control. They entrusted their fate to equipment they had never used and to rescuers they had never met. In war, surrender was unthinkable. Here, it was essential. The ascent itself carried risk. Changes in pressure threatened decompression sickness. Physical weakness magnified psychological strain, yet the system held. Each successful transfer reinforced belief, not in luck but in preparation. This was endurance guided by design. Gradually, the number of men below diminished. The submarine, once alive with motion, grew emptier, its silence now promising rather than fatal. What had seemed inevitable only hours earlier, death by suffocation, was receding, one man at a time. As the final evacuations approached, the margin for failure narrowed to almost nothing. The question was no longer whether rescue was possible, but whether it could be completed before time reclaimed its authority. Long before oxygen gauges reached their limits, the crew confronted another enemy, one without weight or shape. Fear settled into the compartments as surely as the water pressed against the hull. Claustrophobia narrowed perception, compressing time and space into the immediate present. Every sound carried significance. Every delay felt final. Survival was no longer a question of strength, but of control. Training addressed this, though rarely so directly. Submariners were taught to manage stress through routine, to reduce chaos by reducing choice. Orders were clear, movements deliberate. In these conditions, mental resilience mattered as much as mechanical skill. A man who lost composure endangered not only himself, but the fragile sequence holding the rescue together. Discipline became a form of protection. The irony of the moment was striking. These sailors had been conditioned for aggression, for decisive action taken in secrecy. Now they were required to wait, to yield initiative, to trust processes beyond their command. Vulnerability replaced dominance. Patience replaced speed. Teamwork, stripped of hierarchy, became the only path forward. Leadership bore a particular weight. Officers had to project certainty where none existed, to preserve order without revealing doubt. Their calm was not deception, it was necessity. Below the surface, uncertainty multiplied faster than fear. Structure slowed it. On the surface, rescuers faced their own psychological strain, operating under the knowledge that failure would be immediate and irreversible. Environmental pressure compounded mental strain. Darkness obscured progress. The submarine's confinement intensified every emotion. Men learned to measure themselves, to breathe evenly, to focus on tasks small enough to be completed. Psychological endurance was built moment by moment, reinforced by procedure and by the visible success of each completed extraction. As evacuation continued, fear transformed. It did not vanish, but it narrowed. Anxiety focused on specific steps, specific outcomes. This focus was its own victory. It allowed men to function within the shrinking window of survival. The mind, like the machinery, adapted under stress. What ultimately carried the crew through was not heroism in the conventional sense. It was restraint, trust, the willingness to surrender control to a system and to one another. In war, these qualities were often secondary. Here, they were decisive. As the rescue neared completion, it became clear that the operation's success depended not only on engineering and coordination, but on the quiet, disciplined endurance of the men inside the hull. An endurance tested to its limit and not yet released. The final phase of the rescue unfolded under the most unforgiving conditions of all. Below the surface, only a handful of men remained inside the submarine, the air now thin and sharp in the lungs. Above, the sea had begun to turn. Wind shifted the vessel's holding position, testing cables and alignment. What had been an engineering problem became a test of endurance, played out in minutes that felt immeasurable. Each remaining extraction carried disproportionate weight. The systems were unchanged, but the margin for failure had narrowed almost to nothing. Fatigue pressed on rescuers and survivors alike. Hands trembled not from fear alone, but from exhaustion, yet procedure held, pressure was equalized, hatches sealed and reopened. The sequence continued because it had to. When the final crew members entered the rescue chamber, the Submarine was no longer a vessel in the conventional sense. It had been emptied of purpose, stripped of its role in war. Its machinery, once calibrated for pursuit and evasion, now existed only to sustain life for a few more critical moments. The irony was complete. A weapon designed to vanish beneath the sea now depended on being found, measured, and handled with care. The ascent to the surface was slow, deliberate. As pressure eased, bodies reacted unpredictably. Men fought dizziness, nausea, and the sudden rush of sensation returning to limbs dulled by confinement. Rescuers watched closely, ready to intervene, aware that survival could still be undone in these final minutes. The sea, patient until now, offered no guarantees. Then the chamber broke the surface. Fresh air rushed in, cold, damp, unmistakably alive. For the first time in days, lungs filled without resistance. Sounds expanded beyond steel walls. Wind, waves, human voices raised not in command, but relief. One by one, the men were lifted out, supported by hands that only hours earlier had been theoretical solutions on a chart. The U-boat remained below, silent and intact, its mission concluded without a shot fired. It would not return to patrol lanes or shadow convoys. Its final contribution to the war was not destruction, but preservation. In a conflict defined by loss, it ended as a lifeboat. Survival, in the end, had not belonged to any single factor. It emerged from balance, engineering precise enough to function at the edge of feasibility, courage restrained enough to avoid fatal haste, and human willpower steady enough to endure uncertainty. Remove any one of these, and the outcome would have been different. As the rescued crew stood on deck, wrapped against the cold, the sea closed again above the place where their vessel still rested. The Atlantic returned to its indifference. But for those who had broken its surface, the meaning of survival had changed, reshaped not by victory, but by the quiet knowledge of how close it had come to ending unseen. When the final crew members emerged from the rescue chamber, there was no immediate celebration. Relief arrived first as silence, an almost disbelieving pause as rescuers confirmed what their instruments and eyes were telling them. Against every projection, every cautious estimate, the men were alive. The sea had been held back. Time, for once, had been delayed. Those involved in the operation understood how narrow the margin had been. Engineers replayed decisions in their minds, depth calculations, pressure tolerances, equipment never intended for repeated use under such strain. Sailors reflected on station keeping in hostile waters, on holding position while the war continued around them. Nothing about the rescue had followed routine doctrine. It had succeeded because doctrine had been bent without being broken. For the rescued crew, the experience settled more slowly. Exposure to open air felt unreal. Balance returned unevenly. Faces bore the marks of confinement and fatigue, yet beneath the physical weakness was a clarity that came only after survival. They had passed through a boundary few returned from, and the knowledge carried weight rather than triumph. The irony was unmistakable. This submarine, once an instrument of fear, engineered to sever supply lines and vanish without warning, had become a symbol of endurance. Its final chapter was not written in torpedo wakes or sinking hulls, but in measured ascents and sealed hatches. In the logic of war, this outcome made little sense. In human terms, it made perfect sense. As the rescue concluded, the atmosphere shifted from urgency to reflection. There was no enemy fire, no victory signal. Instead, there was recognition of the restraint shown under pressure, of the discipline that prevented panic, of the collaboration that bridged ranks and roles. The operation had required bravery, but not the kind often celebrated. It demanded patience, trust, and respect for limits. This moment marked a turning point not only for those present, but for naval thinking itself. The success demonstrated that survival beneath the sea was not solely a matter of chance. With preparation, coordination, and innovation, rescue was possible even under wartime constraints. What had once been considered implausible became precedent. In the months and years that followed, lessons from this operation would be studied carefully, procedures refined, equipment redesigned, training adjusted to include not just combat but recovery. The rescue became a benchmark, a quiet but decisive proof that technology built for war could be adapted to preserve life when necessity demanded it. Yet for all its technical significance, the true meaning of the rescue lay elsewhere. It resided in the moment when steel yielded to air, when procedure overcame panic, and when men who had accepted death were returned to the surface. The Atlantic resumed its indifference, but it had been forced, briefly, to release its hold. The war would continue. Other submarines would be lost. Other crews would not return. But this moment endured as a reminder that even within a conflict defined by destruction, restraint and ingenuity could still assert themselves. What had begun as a silent coffin beneath the waves ended as a testament, not to victory over an enemy, but to survival itself. And in that distinction, the operation found its lasting place in history. Survival did not conclude when the men stepped onto the deck. For many, it began a quieter struggle that unfolded long after the sea released them. The body recovered faster than the mind. Sleep came unevenly. Enclosed spaces provoked unease. Ordinary silence carried echoes of steel compartments and measured breathing. The ordeal had ended, but its imprint remained. Among the survivors, a bond formed that defied rank or background. They had shared something absolute, a period in which life was reduced to air, time, and trust. Words were often unnecessary. A glance could recall the darkness, the waiting, the discipline that had kept panic at bay. This connection endured because it was built not on victory, but on survival narrowly achieved. The irony of their salvation followed them. These men had served aboard a machine designed to take life efficiently and invisibly. Yet their own lives had been preserved by ingenuity, patience, and courage, qualities applied not in combat, but in restraint. In some cases, rescue had depended on individuals operating in contested waters, risking their own safety for men they had been trained to destroy. War rarely allowed for such contradictions, but this episode made them unavoidable. For many, the experience marked a turning point. The certainty that had once accompanied service faded, replaced by humility. They had confronted a boundary beyond which training and will alone could not carry them. Gratitude emerged not as sentiment, but as perspective. Survival had not been earned in the conventional sense. It had been granted through cooperation and circumstance. The rescuers carried their own burdens forward. They returned to duty with the knowledge that they had held lives in balance, that their precision and restraint had mattered as much as any engagement. Some spoke little of the operation. Others studied it, refining procedures, determined that what had been learned under pressure would not be lost. For them, rescue was no longer theoretical. Over time, the memory of the submarine itself shifted. It ceased to be merely a weapon or a near grave. It became a reference point, a moment when the logic of war bent toward preservation. Survivors measured later hardships against that descent, that waiting, that ascent into air. Few experiences matched its clarity. The war moved on, indifferent to individual survival. Other boats were lost. Other crews vanished without recovery, yet this rescue lingered in naval thinking and in private reflection. It demonstrated that even within industrialized conflict, outcomes were not always final. That ingenuity could serve life as effectively as destruction. In the years that followed, survivors carried forward a changed understanding of risk, authority, and trust. Some remained at sea. Others left service altogether. All carried the knowledge that survival had come not from dominance but from dependence, on systems, on others, on calm maintained under pressure. What endured was not triumph but perspective. They had entered the war as operators of a machine. They emerged as witnesses to its limits. And in that realization, their lives were forever altered, not by what they had destroyed, but by what they had been allowed to keep. In the immediate aftermath, the operation was spoken of in careful terms. It had succeeded where failure was expected, and that alone unsettled long-held assumptions. Submarines were accepted as weapons that operated beyond the reach of rescue. Once lost beneath the sea, their crews were considered casualties in waiting. This rescue disrupted that certainty. It demonstrated that survival was not always a matter of chance, but sometimes of preparation, restraint, and resolve. The irony was difficult to ignore. What had begun as a potential catastrophe, one more silent loss in an already crowded ledger of the Atlantic War, became a reference point for ingenuity under pressure. A scenario defined by mechanical failure and human vulnerability evolved into a case study in collaboration. The same environment that had magnified danger revealed, under the right conditions, the possibility of control. Naval authorities took notice, quietly at first, then with intention. Reports were written, procedures reviewed, assumptions challenged. Engineers revisited hatch designs, pressure tolerances, and rescue interfaces. Training manuals were amended to acknowledge what had previously gone unspoken, that submariners might one day need to be recovered, not avenged. The sea was still unforgiving, but it was no longer absolute. This marked a turning point in how underwater warfare was understood. Submarines remained instruments of stealth and destruction, but their crews were no longer regarded as irretrievable once submerged. Rescue doctrine began to evolve alongside combat doctrine. Equipment once considered auxiliary gained prominence. The idea that every descent carried a recoverable margin entered naval thinking. The broader implications extended beyond any single navy. Other maritime powers studied the operation, extracting lessons divorced from ideology. The physics of pressure, the psychology of confinement, the mechanics of controlled ascent, these did not belong to one flag. What mattered was that a boundary had been crossed. Possibility had replaced fatalism. Over time, the rescue became less about the individuals involved and more about what it represented. It illustrated that innovation did not always announce itself through new weapons or greater firepower. Sometimes it appeared in the refusal to accept loss as inevitable. The same ingenuity that built machines capable of vanishing beneath the ocean could, when redirected, preserve the lives inside them. For submariners who followed, this legacy was both technical and psychological. They trained knowing that survival protocols existed, that contingency was not an abstraction. This knowledge did not make their service safer in any absolute sense, but it altered the relationship between risk and resignation. Hope, however measured, had been engineered into the system. Historically, the rescue occupies a quiet place. It did not change the outcome of the war. It did not dominate headlines or alter strategic balances. Its importance lies elsewhere, in the way it reframed what was considered possible under extreme conditions. It stood as evidence that even in a conflict defined by efficiency and loss, human judgment could intervene meaningfully. The disaster that might have been became a foundation. From it emerged safer procedures, improved designs, and a deeper understanding of the human element in underwater warfare. The sea did not become kinder, but navies became wiser. In the end, the legacy of the rescue is not measured in tonnage saved or enemies denied. It is measured in continuity, in the lives that returned to the surface, and in the generations of sailors who descended afterward knowing that, if the unimaginable happened, they might not be entirely alone beneath the waves. Survival carried a cost that could not be measured in hours or machinery. For the men who had been rescued, the memory of near death remained vivid and precise. It returned in confined rooms, in the sound of sealed doors, in moments of silence that stretched too long. The experience had not faded into abstraction. It had settled into them, shaping how they measured risk, time, and control. They understood better than most the extraordinary chain of decisions that had allowed them to live. Each calculation made on the surface, each seal aligned in darkness, had balanced on uncertainty. Their survival was not a product of inevitability, but of convergence, technical skill meeting human restraint under pressure. That knowledge carried gratitude, but also weight. The irony of their story followed them. A mission designed to destroy had become an account of preservation. The submarine, conceived as an extension of industrial warfare, ended its service as a shelter long enough to allow rescue. In a conflict that rewarded efficiency and finality, this outcome resisted simple interpretation. It forced a reconsideration of purpose. For many, this realization altered their relationship with duty. Courage was no longer synonymous with aggression. It had been redefined through patience, obedience to procedure, and trust in others. The war continued, but its meaning narrowed. Victory and defeat felt distant compared to the clarity of having survived when survival was never guaranteed. Those who had participated in the rescue carried their own reckoning. They had confronted the edge of feasibility and stepped across it deliberately. The operation demanded precision without spectacle, courage without acclaim. Knowing what had been risked and how easily it might have failed left a lasting impression. They had not defeated an enemy. They had preserved lives. What emerged from this convergence of danger and restraint was a reaffirmation of human capability. Not the capacity to destroy, which the war demonstrated daily, but the capacity to adapt under constraint. Technical expertise alone would not have been enough, nor would resolve without method. It was their combination that transformed catastrophe into survival. Yet the price remained, the memory of suffocation narrowly avoided, the awareness of how little separated life from silence. These did not disappear with time. They became part of the survivor's internal landscape, a quiet reminder of limits and of the fragile cyst. MS that sustain life beneath the surface. In the broader arc of history, this episode occupies a modest space. It did not redirect campaigns or alter outcomes. Its importance lies in its human dimension. It revealed that even within a war engineered for destruction, moments of preservation could occur when skill, discipline, and restraint aligned. The rescued crew did not return unchanged. Neither did those who saved them. The sea had tested both and allowed them to pass, not without cost, but with meaning intact. What remained was not triumph in the conventional sense, but a deeper understanding of survival itself. The mission had begun as an instrument of war. It ended as a testament to humanity. And in that transformation, it revealed the true price and value of survival. The rescue is often remembered through its outcome. The men who surfaced alive, the submarine that did not become a grave. Less visible are those who made that outcome possible. Engineers bent over calculations in cramped compartments, sailors held vessels steady in uncertain seas, and technicians trusted equipment that had never been tested under such conditions. Their work unfolded without spectacle, defined by concentration rather than acclaim. Many of them never saw the men they saved. They worked through instruments, diagrams, and procedures, translating theory into action under relentless pressure. Decisions were made quickly but never casually. A fraction of an inch in alignment, a minute lost to hesitation, these could erase any chance of success. Responsibility was carried quietly without ceremony. The irony of their role endured. These individuals were trained for war, yet their most consequential actions preserved life rather than ended it. In a conflict that measured success through destruction, their contribution resisted simple classification. There were no enemy vessels sunk, no territory gained. What they changed were outcomes measured in human breath. Risk was constant. Rescue vessels operated in contested waters, exposed to detection while holding position for hours. Engineers pushed machinery beyond designed limits, knowing failure would be immediate and irreversible. Compassion did not remove danger. It required confronting it directly, without the psychological distance that combat sometimes provides. Afterward, recognition was limited. The operation did not align neatly with narratives of victory. Reports were filed, lessons recorded, and duties resumed. For many involved, the rescue became something personal, a quiet reference point rather than a public achievement. They carried the knowledge of what had been attempted and what had been saved. This is where the nature of heroism becomes clear. It did not emerge from confrontation, but from restraint, from patience under pressure, from the willingness to accept responsibility for lives unseen. These men and women acted not because they were ordered to be heroic, but because the situation demanded precision, empathy, and resolve. The rescued crew understood this intimately. Survival had not come from chance alone. It had come from strangers who chose to engage with impossibility rather than accept it. That understanding endured long after the details of the operation faded. In historical accounts, such figures often remain peripheral. Their work lacks the drama of battle, the clarity of victory. Yet without them, the story would end differently. Their contribution reminds us that war is not sustained only by those who fight, but also by those who preserve. Heroism in this context was not loud. It was measured. It existed in the careful alignment of equipment, in the decision to hold position a little longer, in the refusal to abandon hope when calculations said otherwise. The rescue succeeded because of these unsung participants, because they applied ingenuity and compassion where destruction was easier. And in doing so, they altered the lives of others in ways that no official commendation could fully capture. They had been trapped beneath the waves, facing death measured in breaths rather than bullets. No enemy stood before them, no battle line could be drawn. There was only steel, pressure, and time closing in. In that darkness, the outcome seemed preordained. And yet it was not. What unfolded instead revealed something quieter and more enduring than victory. The rescue did not rely on a single act of brilliance or a moment of defiance. It emerged from accumulation, of training absorbed over years, of engineering refined through trial, of discipline maintained when fear offered easier alternatives. Hope was not assumed. It was constructed, step by careful step, from procedures designed to function even when belief faltered. This is where the story departs from the familiar language of war. There were no opposing forces locked in struggle, no decisive blow that ended the contest. Instead, there was cooperation under strain, patience where haste would have killed. Trust in systems and in people at the precise moment when both seemed insufficient. Courage expressed itself not in action, but in restraint. The submarine itself stands at the center of this transformation. Built to disappear, to deliver destruction unseen, it became something else entirely. Its compartments turned from instruments of war into spaces of waiting. Its hatches, once sealed for stealth, were opened for survival. The machine did not change. Its purpose did. What this rescue revealed was not the triumph of technology alone, but the alignment of human will with technical possibility. Either one without the other would have failed. Skill without calm would have collapsed into panic. Courage without method would have ended in tragedy. Survival belonged to neither impulse nor intellect by itself, but to their balance. In the darkest hours of the war, this balance mattered. The conflict offered countless examples of efficiency turned toward destruction. This episode offered something rarer, a demonstration that ingenuity could also preserve, that even within systems designed to take life, there remained the capacity to save it. The men who emerged from the sea carried that understanding forward. They did not speak of triumph in the language of conquest. They spoke of breath, of light, of the moment steel gave way to air. For them, survival was not abstract. It was physical, immediate, and unforgettable. The rescuers carried it too. They returned to duty with a quiet certainty that their work had meaning beyond orders fulfilled. They had confronted the limits of possibility and pushed against them, not recklessly, but deliberately. They had proven that precision and compassion could coexist, even in war. History would not pause for this moment. The Atlantic would claim other vessels. Other crews would not return. But this rescue endured as a counterpoint, a reminder that outcomes were not always final and that fatalism was not the only response to catastrophe. In the end, the story resolves not with conquest, but with return. Men who had prepared to die instead stood again beneath an open sky. A submarine built for war became a stage for heroism. And beneath the sea, where silence had nearly claimed them, lives were not only saved, but forever changed.